Ready for your next adventure? KLM Royal Dutch Airlines brings you Real Deal Days, your chance to uncover real adventures and create real memories. Taste the real Amsterdam, explore the real Barcelona, and discover the real Johannesburg, along with many more destinations around the world. Secure your real deal today and seize the moment with KLM Royal Dutch Airlines. Restrictions apply. See terms and conditions at klm.com.
Your data is like gold to hackers, and they'll sell it to the highest bidder. Are you protected? McAfee helps shield you, blocking suspicious texts, malicious emails, and fraudulent websites. McAfee Secure VPN lets you browse safely, and its AI-powered text scam detector spots threats instantly. You'll also get up to $2 million of award-winning antivirus and identity theft protection, all for just $39.99 for your first year. Visit McAfee.com. Cancel anytime. Terms apply.
When students occupied campuses last year to protest the war in Gaza, Donald Trump was quick to use the demonstrations as talking points for his campaign.
When I'm president, we will not allow our colleges to be taken over by violent radicals. And if you come here from another country and try to bring jihadism or anti-Americanism or anti-Semitism to our campuses, we will immediately deport you. You'll be out of that school.
Now, President Trump is making good on his promise. This weekend, ICE agents detained 30-year-old Mahmoud Khalil, a Palestinian who completed a graduate degree at Columbia University in December. Sarah Brown is an editor at the Chronicle of Higher Education, and she's been following Khalil's story.
According to his lawyer, they said, your student visa has been revoked. Then, there was some confusion because he's no longer a student. He is a permanent resident who is married to a U.S. citizen. So then his wife, who was with him, according to his lawyer, went up to go get his green card because they said he's a permanent resident. That's what his lawyer said. And the ICE agent said, well, we've been told by the State Department that they revoked your green card too. So they took him into custody.
Khalil was taken to a detention center in Louisiana, more than 1,000 miles away from his wife in New York City. She's currently 8 months pregnant. A federal judge has blocked his deportation for now, pending a hearing that'll take place later today. According to outlets like CNN and the New York Times, the Trump administration is invoking obscure language from the Immigration and Nationality Act in order to strip Khalil of his green card. That legislation says that the Secretary of State can deport any alien who would have, quote, potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences for the United States. It's a description that Republicans like House Speaker Mike Johnson are eager to play up.
If you are on a student visa and you're in America and you're an aspiring young terrorist who wants to prey upon your Jewish classmates, you're going home. We're going to arrest your tail and we're going to send you home where you belong. And this is just getting started.
But there isn't any evidence to back up Johnson's claim that Khalil is an aspiring young terrorist.
The Trump administration has not presented evidence at this time that Khalil has committed a crime or has done something else that would endanger his legal status. So at this point, there's a lot of information that we don't have.
What we do know about Khalil is that he was one of the few students who lent his name and face to Columbia's protest movement last spring.
Critics have said that these protests have essentially promoted anti-Semitic rhetoric, have essentially harassed Jewish students, have promoted anti-Semitism. That is the argument of many critics. And so Khalil has become someone who has gotten a lot of attention for being sort of the face of a protest movement that has been called anti-Semitic by Republican lawmakers for some time.
But Khalil's own words tell a different story about the kind of protest he was trying to lead last spring. CNN's Wolf Blitzer interviewed Khalil in April.
Mahmoud, as you know, threats and fear of violence have driven many Jewish students from the campus at Columbia. What do you say to people who say the campus is now an unsafe place for Jewish students?
Once again, I would say that the liberation of Palestine and the Palestinians and the Jewish people are intertwined. They go hand in hand. Anti-Semitism and any other form of racism has no place on this campus and in this movement.
Columbia University agrees with the Trump administration when it says anti-Semitism on campus is a problem. But that hasn't stopped the university from becoming a target as well. The day before Khalil's arrest, the Trump administration announced it would cancel $400 million in grants and contracts to Columbia, saying it was because Columbia wasn't taking its anti-Semitism problem seriously. How did the school respond to those cuts?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. I'm a higher ed reporter. I have been for a decade, and this is not something that we've seen. This kind of action targeting a single university. The way that Columbia responded is really striking, I think, because they have essentially acknowledged that the Trump administration has a point. They say, we are taking seriously their allegations that, anti-Semitism is happening on this campus, and we are committed to responding to it. That's not necessarily what you would expect, right? I mean, you might expect that Columbia losing $400 million in its federal grants would be a reason to sort of get defensive.
This week, Trump said Khalil's removal would be the first of many to come. The official White House Twitter account celebrated the start of this crackdown with a mocking post that said, "Shalom, Mahmoud." The administration also sent warnings to 60 universities that they could lose funding too, just like Columbia. This story, on its face, it's about elite colleges trying to figure out how to operate during Trump's second term. But there's a lot going on. We've got elements of an immigration story. There's foreign policy involved. There are questions about free speech on campus. I'm wondering, underneath everything, is there a primary issue that's animating all these other issues?
I think what we're seeing across all of these issues is a deeper question about what colleges and universities teach and who gets to decide what colleges and universities are teaching or promoting or espousing. And traditionally in the United States, there has been a commitment to academic freedom and free speech. And what we're seeing with this new administration is an attempt to be a little bit more prescriptive in what colleges and what people on college campuses can or can't say, both in the classrooms and at a protest.
Today on the show, the Trump administration says it's going after anti-Semitism in higher education, but the chilling effect could reach far beyond college campuses. I'm Rob Gunther, sitting in for Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around.
Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Listen to Washington Wise, an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, to hear the stories making news in Washington right now. Host Mike Townsend, Charles Schwab's managing director for legislative and regulatory affairs, takes a nonpartisan look at the stories that matter most to investors, including policy initiatives for retirement savings, taxes and trade, inflation concerns, the Federal Reserve, and how regulatory developments can affect companies, sectors, and even the entire market. Mike and his guests offer their perspective on how policy changes could affect what you do with your portfolio. Download the latest episode and follow at schwab.com/WashingtonWise or wherever you listen.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
This is not just a story about Columbia. Just like the student protest movement was not only happening on Columbia's campus, but why do you think this school in particular keeps playing such a central role in the headlines?
I think Columbia is, frankly, a high-profile institution. It's an easy target. If you want to make an example out of a particular university, Columbia is a great place to start because, frankly, there are a handful of universities that are the subject of great fascination in the sort of the public discourse, and it's Harvard, Yale, Stanford, MIT, Columbia. You hear those same names over and over again. So if you are trying to make a point, poking Columbia is a pretty good way of doing it.
And they also had a central role in the protest movement last year. Were their protests unique in any way?
I think to understand why Columbia became a target of the Trump administration, you have to go back to the start of the war in Gaza in the fall of 2023. So pretty much immediately after the war in Gaza began, Columbia saw protests. And within a month, university administrators had actually suspended the Columbia chapters of two activist groups, Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace, for allegedly violating campus policies related to holding protests. So the battle lines were drawn early. Then a few more months go by. There are regular protests. There are clashes with the administration. Administrators start revising protest policies, considering new efforts to kind of crack down on enforcement of the rules around where you can have protests, how you can have protests. And then we come to April of 2024, and Columbia University's president is brought before Congress to testify about the university's handling of Gaza protests. As House Republicans put it, Columbia's failure to combat anti-Semitism. That was their take. That was their belief. And at this hearing, Columbia's then president, Manoush Shafik, she essentially said, Congress, we are going to enforce the rules. We are not afraid to enforce the rules. If faculty members and students violate our rules, if they promote anti-Semitic materials or espouse anti-Semitic views, we will take action.
We developed, in consultation with our anti-Semitism task force, a new demonstration policy, which clarified what would happen to students who attended unsanctioned events. Anyone who attends an unsanctioned event is immediately sent a warning letter. And
she really drew a line in the sand. And pro-Palestinian protesters on campus heard her, and they put up an encampment on Columbia's main quad. And they said, we are not leaving until the university divests from Israel. And that really touched off a nationwide protest movement. There were encampments at more than 100 campuses all over the country. And at Columbia, the situation got even more tense because the president, Manoush Shafik, called the New York Police Department to break up the encampment.
The images of more than 100 peaceful student protesters on the lawn being arrested, in some cases being physically carried off campus by the NYPD, that caught the attention of the national media. It also prompted condemnation from Barnard and Columbia faculty members, as well as from free speech advocacy organizations. That decision also escalated tensions between students and administrators. Then Columbia students, with the help of some outside protesters, they decided to try some more extreme tactics.
One thing I want to be really clear about is that it is unusual for a university to call the police on their students. I think to some faculty and students on campus, calling the police on students crosses a line. I do want to be clear as well that as part of those spring 2024 protests, there was a point at which some protesters occupied a campus building. And I think for university administrators, occupying a building and causing property damage and that kind of thing does even cross a line from violating campus rules into potentially violating laws.
The protests escalated. The university and the city of New York cracked down. There was no graduation ceremony last year. I'm wondering what the mood was like on campus after students returned from summer break and after Trump won the election in November.
So last fall was interesting. We had, at Columbia, as well as across the country, universities that had enacted new protest policies. And it seemed like some of the pro-Palestinian activism that we saw in the spring was a little bit quieter. There were still protests, let me be clear. For example, there was a disruption of a campus job fair at Cornell University that got a ton of attention and led to arrests. And in fact, there was an issue involving the potential deportation of an international student in that particular protest, and that did not actually transpire. But the fall semester was, especially at Columbia, was certainly not as intense in terms of protests, encampments. We weren't seeing that at Columbia, but we certainly were still seeing activism.
Columbia also created this new disciplinary committee, right? The Office of Institutional Equity. What was the purpose of that body, and what did it do?
Essentially, this body is dedicated to, the university says, combating allegations of anti-Semitism and other discrimination. So this Office of Institutional Equity, which is apparently a committee that is leading investigations, they have reportedly put a number of students under investigation for criticizing Israel in ways that the university alleges may create a hostile environment for Jewish students. And as the university sees it, that could be a problem under federal law. And according to the reporting we've seen, this new investigative unit has, for example, put a student under investigation for an op-ed in the student newspaper that criticized Israel. So the university says we are just taking steps to enforce civil rights laws on our campus. People who are proponents of sort of pro-Palestinian activism see this as a blatant attack on free speech on campus.
And then November comes and Trump wins. And one of the many executive orders he signs takes aim at colleges and universities. How have schools, and Columbia in particular, been targets of Trump since he won?
So as 2025 gets underway, the Trump administration takes aim at colleges and universities pretty much right away. He signs executive orders targeting diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, transgender athletes, and he takes aim at anti-Semitism. He threatens to deport international students. And I think what we've seen is that Trump has really tried to put colleges on notice that if they do not take his interpretations of law and his policies seriously, they could face investigation and lose their federal funding.
And in this case, it seems like they've done both. They've lost their funding, and they have been cracking down on what they perceive as anti-Semitism. It's kind of like they're playing both sides of this.
Yeah, and to be clear, Columbia has not lost all of its federal funding. It actually has about $5 billion in federal funding, and according to the Trump administration, they have so far canceled $400 million of contracts. It's a lot of money. It's not all of their federal funding. I just wanted to clarify that.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's really interesting about Columbia is if you look at the actions that they've been taking in recent months, they have been really drawing a line in the sand. And it feels like some of those actions have been designed to appease the Trump administration. And so far, it hasn't worked, right? I mean, the Trump administration still has come after Columbia's federal funding. So I think there's a question of if you are a university that is potentially a target of the Trump administration, how do you react? Because if you try to appease the administration and comply with all of their directives, maybe that doesn't even help you.
After the break, how funding fights threaten not just the existence of American universities, but also the future of medical innovation.
Are your ulcerative colitis symptoms proving difficult to manage? Tremfya guselkumab can help you manage the cycle of UC symptoms. At 1 year, many patients taking Tremfya achieved clinical remission, and some patients also achieved endoscopic remission. Individual results may vary. Tremfya is a prescription medicine used to treat adults with moderately to severely active ulcerative colitis. Serious allergic reactions and increased risk of infections may occur. Before treatment, your doctor should check you for infections and TB. Tell your doctor if you have an infection, flu-like symptoms, or if you need a vaccine. Ask your doctor if Tremfya can help you manage the cycle of UC symptoms. Call 1-800-526-7736 to learn more, or visit tremfyaradio.com.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
Still getting around to that fix on your car? You got this. On eBay, you'll find millions of parts guaranteed to fit. Doesn't matter if it's a major engine repair or your first time swapping your windshield wipers. eBay has that part you need, ready to click perfectly into place for changes big and small. Loud or quiet, find all the parts you need at prices you'll love. Guaranteed to fit every time. But you already know that. eBay. Things, people, love. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
Tell me about the $400 million in cuts in the form of grants and contracts. Do we know what that money is going to target?
We're still getting clarity on the scope of what this $400 million could include. But according to the Trump administration, it could involve any contract or grant having to do with the Education Department or Health and Human Services, which oversees the National Institutes of Health, which is the largest funder of biomedical research in the country.
You mentioned in your reporting that it's unclear how legal these funding cuts are. What do we know?
So typically, there's a process if federal funding is going to be canceled. There is supposed to be a letter of findings presented to an institution that explains, this is why we feel that you have been in violation of federal law, federal regulations. There's supposed to be due process in a case like this. As far as we know, in Columbia's case, that has not happened at this point.
I'm wondering if we could zoom out. Maybe it's worth talking about the central role federal funding plays in higher education across the board. So when we're talking about grants and contracts, where are they coming from and what are they funding?
Let me just be really clear here that higher education in this country needs federal funding to exist. Most colleges and universities would not be able to function at all without federal funding. Much of that funding goes toward financial aid for students. So students receive grants and loans that help them pay their college tuition. There's also a very large chunk of money that goes toward funding research. And this includes research on cancer drugs, on Alzheimer's, on all sorts of things. Any form of research you can think of, the federal government is funding it. And so the Trump administration has a large bucket of money to hold over colleges' heads. And that's part of why universities are taking these directives so seriously.
Yeah. And to get specific here and to talk about how immediate this is, your reporting showed 8 projects in particular that had funding pulled, including programs to study the effects of exposure to opioids on preterm infants, or money that's going to the development of a potential malaria vaccine. I mean, it's not just that schools are getting shut down. The implications are going to be felt on a much wider scale.
If you talk to scientists and really anyone who is in and around higher education, that's what they'll point to. They will say, first of all, that, even if, for example, a court order directs the Trump administration to restore some of this grant funding, experiments aren't like a spigot that you can just turn on and off. You need consistency and predictability in where the money is coming from in order to do some of this really important research that we're talking about here. And universities, as they are belt tightening and being more cautious with their money, they are cutting the number of PhD students and doctoral students that they are accepting to start programs this fall. And in a lot of these research labs, it's the doctoral students who are helping do a lot of the research. And these students are the future of science and academia in general. They are the future of research in this country. And so the concerns that many academics have is that even a temporary disruption is going to have wide-reaching and long-term impacts.
It's hard not to imagine this moment in the context of the current Department of Education, which is embarking on a so-called final mission. How does that play into all of this?
Yeah, and we now have a newly installed Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, and she has essentially said we will be, as much as possible, dismantling the federal role in education and sending it back to the states. And there's an interesting tension here where the Trump administration says it wants to get rid of the education department, but it also wants to leverage the powers of the federal government to go after universities where it doesn't like what they're doing or what they're saying. And it seems like, in some ways, that the Trump administration wants to have it both ways. They want to get the political win of dismantling the education department, and then they also want to have federal investigations of colleges and universities for anti-Semitism, for all sorts of other things where they feel universities are not in alignment with their agenda. And it'll be really interesting to see where we go from here because, again, a smaller education department is not going to be able to carry out the kinds of investigations that the Trump administration says it wants to carry out.
I was hoping you could talk about what happened at Georgetown Law, because I think this serves as a good counterexample of how schools have been dealing with a hostile administration. Last week, we saw Ed Martin. He's the interim U.S. attorney for Washington, D.C. He took aim at Georgetown over its DEI policies. And my understanding is he threatened that his office would not hire Georgetown grads if the school didn't comply. Do you know what happened after that?
So the dean responded in this letter basically saying that the First Amendment guarantees a university the right to, quote, determine on academic grounds who may teach, what to teach, and how to teach it. And I think it'll be really interesting to see in the coming weeks and months what kind of posture colleges and universities adopt in response to the Trump administration and where that lands them. So increasingly, you're seeing education advocates, lawyers, for example, who have said, what the Trump administration is trying to do violates the law. That, for example, directing the eradication of all diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, including a wide range of student support efforts and offices promoting cultural diversity and academic departments that teach about race and equity, that is not legal. So I'll be really interested to see how universities position themselves in response to the Trump administration's directives. They have to take them seriously because federal funding is really important to higher education. On the other hand, I think you're seeing a lot of students and faculty on campuses who want their universities to take a stand for their values and to say, we value diversity. Valuing diversity is not illegal, and we are going to stand by our principles.
Sarah, thank you so much for your time. I'm really grateful.
Thank you.
Sarah Brown is the news editor at the Chronicle for Higher Education. And that's the show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Anna Phillips, Madeline Ducharme, and Ethan Oberman. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. Hillary Fry is our Editor-in-Chief. And I'm Rob Gunther, filling in for Mary Harris. You can find me over at Blue Sky. I'm at OneRobGunther. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.